The lock on my bedroom door would not hold much longer. I could hear him downstairs, shouting at his brother, throwing something against the wall hard enough to make the ceiling light shiver above my head. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my phone twice before I managed to unlock the screen. My name is Elena Whitfield, and 3 hours ago, I made a decision that could either save my life or end it completely. I pressed my back against the door and slid down until I was sitting on the cold floor, my knees pulled up to my chest. My cheek throbbed where Victor had struck me earlier that evening, and my wrist ached from where he had grabbed me when I tried to leave the dinner table. I had learned, over the past 8 months, exactly how far I could push him before things turned dangerous. Tonight I had pushed too far by simply telling him I did not want to marry him anymore. Victor Hale did not accept refusal. His family did not either. Downstairs, his brother Callum said something I could not make out, and Victor's voice rose again, sharp and furious. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The house we were in belonged to his family, a large stone building at the edge of the city, where the streetlights seemed to grow dimmer the closer you got to their gate. I had moved in 4 months ago, against every instinct that told me to run instead. I looked down at my phone. There was a number saved there that I had never called, given to me weeks ago by a woman named Priya, who cleaned houses in this same wealthy district. She had pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand, outside a grocery store, and told me, in a low voice, that if I ever needed real help, the kind police could not give me, I should call this number and say only one sentence. Tell them Damien needs to know. I had laughed nervously at the time, certain I would never need such a thing. Everyone in this part of the city knew the name Damien Cross, even if they pretended not to. He was spoken about in careful whispers, the kind of man restaurant owners nodded to without being asked, the kind of man whose cars never got parking tickets. Some called him dangerous. Others called him the only fair man left in a city full of liars. I had never seen him in person, only heard the stories, and I had certainly never imagined I would be the one dialing his number from the floor of a locked bedroom with a bruise blooming under my eye. But the footsteps on the stairs decided for me. I heard Victor's heavy tread, uneven with anger, and whatever he had been drinking, and I heard him mutter my name like a curse. The doorknob rattled. I typed the message with fingers that would not stop trembling, and pressed send before I could talk myself out of it. Tell Damien Elena Whitfield needs him, please. I do not have much time. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. Victor's fist came down against the wood, 3 heavy blows that made the whole frame shudder. Elena? His voice was thick and slurred, but the threat underneath it was perfectly clear. Open this door right now. I did not answer. I backed away from the door on my hands and knees, my eyes darting around the small room for anything I could use, anything at all. There was a heavy lamp on the nightstand, a chair I could wedge under the handle. I grabbed the chair first, jamming it beneath the doorknob the way I had seen done in old films, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard it hurt. You do not get to decide this is over, Victor said through the door. You belong to this family now. My father arranged everything. You think you can just walk away because you got scared? I had not gotten scared. I had gotten hurt, repeatedly, in ways I had stopped trying to explain to myself as accidents, but there was no reasoning with him when he was like this, and I had learned that lesson the hard way more than once. My phone buzzed in my hand, a single word from an unknown number. Where? Just that. No greeting, no explanation. I stared at it for a moment, my mind scrambling to catch up. Whoever was on the other end was not interested in conversation. They wanted a location, and they wanted it fast. I typed the address with shaking fingers, the same address I had memorized the day Victor's mother handed me a key and told me this was my new home now, as though I had ever agreed to that in any real sense. I sent it and immediately regretted it, wondering if I had just traded one danger for another. But the wood of the door was already splintering slightly under the pressure of Victor's shoulder, and I did not have the luxury of second thoughts. Open it, he said again, quieter now, which was somehow worse than the shouting. I will not ask a third time. I moved to the window instead, some instinct pulling me there even though we were on the 2nd floor, and there was nothing but a narrow ledge and a long drop to the garden below. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and looked out at the dark street beyond the gate, searching for headlights, for any sign that help was actually coming, and that I had not just imagined a way out for myself, in a moment of pure desperation. Behind me, the chair scraped against the floor as the door gave slightly. "You cannot hide from me in this house," Victor said. "There is nowhere to go." I turned to face the door, because some part of me refused to let him see my back when he finally broke through. I had done that once before, turned away, and it had cost me more than I wanted to remember. This time, I stood my ground, even with my whole body shaking, even with no plan beyond the desperate hope that a man I had never met would somehow arrive before it was too late. The chair finally gave way with a crack of splitting wood. The door swung open, and Victor stood in the frame, his shirt half untucked, his eyes glassy with drink and rage. Behind him, further down the hallway, I heard his father's voice calling out something about keeping the noise down, about not wanting the neighbors to hear. "You think you can just leave," Victor said, stepping into the room. "You think you have anywhere else to be." I backed toward the window, my hands finding the cool wall behind me. "I do not want this anymore, Victor. I have told you that. I am telling you again. It is not your choice to make." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and caught my wrist, his grip tight enough to bruise further, tight enough that I gasped despite myself. "You are mine. My father chose you for this family, and you do not get to decide otherwise because you suddenly grew a conscience." I tried to pull free, and his grip only tightened, twisting slightly in a way that made pain shoot up through my arm. I bit down on the sound that wanted to escape my throat, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hearing me break. That was when I heard it. Tires on gravel, moving fast, coming up the long driveway toward the house. Victor heard it too, his head turning toward the window, his grip loosening just slightly in surprise. "Who is that?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. I did not answer. I did not know myself. Not really. Not beyond a name and a rumor, and a single word typed back to me in the dark. Car doors slammed below, more than one, and then I heard voices, low and controlled, moving toward the front of the house with a kind of purpose that made even Victor's father go quiet downstairs. Victor released my wrist to move toward the window, and I stumbled back, cradling my arm against my chest. Through the glass, I caught a glimpse of dark cars parked at odd angles across the driveway, blocking any chance of escape by vehicle, and men in plain dark clothing moving toward the front door with a calm that felt more frightening than any shouting ever had. "Who let them onto the property?" Victor said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. Downstairs, the front door opened without anyone knocking. I heard Callum's voice, sharp with alarm, and then his father's, trying to sound authoritative and failing. Footsteps moved through the house, unhurried, climbing the stairs with a steadiness that made my pulse pound even harder. Victor turned back to me, some of the anger draining from his face, and being replaced by something closer to uncertainty. "What did you do?" I did not answer him. I was watching the doorway, waiting, my whole body braced for whatever was about to walk through it. A man appeared in the frame first, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat, his eyes sweeping the room in a single sharp motion before landing on me. He said nothing, only stepped aside, and behind him came another figure, taller, moving with a quiet, contained energy that filled the room before he even spoke a word. I had heard people describe Damien Cross before, but nothing had prepared me for actually standing in front of him. He was not what I expected. There was no menace in his posture, no theatrical display of power. He simply looked at me, and then his gaze moved to the bruise darkening under my eye, to the red marks already forming around my wrist, and something in his expression went utterly still. It was not the stillness of calm, it was the stillness of a man holding something back with tremendous effort. "Elena Whitfield," he said, and his voice was quieter than I expected, almost gentle, though there was steel underneath it. "Yes," I managed. His eyes moved once more over the marks on my skin, and I watched his jaw tighten, watched a muscle jump along the line of it. When he finally spoke again, he was not speaking to me. "Get her out of here," he said to the man beside him. "Now." Victor found his voice then, stepping forward with what remained of his earlier bravado. "Now wait just a moment. This is my house. She is my fiancée, and you have no right to—" Damien turned his head slowly toward him, and whatever Victor saw in that look made him stop mid-sentence and take an involuntary step back. "She was never yours," Damien said, his voice low and even, more dangerous for how quiet it remained. "And you are going to regret ever putting your hands on her." I felt the man beside him move closer to me, felt a coat settle gently over my shoulders, covering the torn sleeve of my dress. I let myself be guided toward the door, my legs unsteady beneath me, my mind struggling to catch up with how quickly everything had changed in the span of only a few minutes. As we passed through the doorway, I glanced back once. Victor stood frozen in the middle of the room, his father and brother now visible in the hallway behind Damien, all of them silent, all of them watching this stranger who had walked into their house and taken command of it without raising his voice a single time. Damien did not look back at me as we descended the stairs, but I felt his presence behind me the entire way, steady and unshakable, like a wall between me and everything I was leaving behind. Outside, the night air hit my face, cold and sharp, and for the first time in months I felt something loosen in my chest that I had almost forgotten the shape of. Hope. I did not know yet what this rescue would cost me, or what kind of world I was about to step into. I only knew that the locked door upstairs no longer mattered, and that the man walking silently beside me toward the waiting car had looked at my bruises like they were a personal offense against him. I had no idea, in that moment, how much that look would come to mean. The car moved through the city streets faster than felt safe, though nobody inside seemed concerned about that. I sat pressed against the door, the borrowed coat still wrapped around my shoulders, watching streetlights blur past the window, while my heart continued to pound against my ribs. Damien sat across from me, not beside me, as though he understood that closeness right now would only frighten me further. He had said nothing since we left the house. His hands rested loosely on his knees, but I noticed the way his knuckles had gone pale, the only sign that the calm exterior was costing him something to maintain. "You are safe now," he said finally, breaking the silence without looking directly at me. "Nobody is going to touch you again." I did not know how to respond to that. Safety had become such an unfamiliar concept over the last 8 months that I almost did not recognize the shape of the promise. I pulled the coat tighter around myself instead and stared out the window, watching the wealthy district give way to a quieter, more private part of the city, where the houses sat further apart and the gates grew taller. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "My home," he said. "You will have your own room. A doctor is already waiting there to look at you." "I do not need a doctor." His eyes finally moved to meet mine, and something in his expression made the protest die in my throat. "Elena, there is a bruise the size of my hand on your face, and your wrist is already swelling. You need a doctor." I looked down at my lap, embarrassed in a way I could not fully explain, as though the marks on my body were somehow my fault rather than something done to me. Damien seemed to sense the shift in me, because his voice softened when he spoke again. "None of this is on you," he said. "I need you to understand that clearly, right now, before we get anywhere near my house. Whatever happened to you in that place was not something you brought on yourself." I looked up at him, searching his face for some sign of insincerity, some crack in the calm certainty of his words, and found none. There was only quiet conviction there, and a kind of anger that seemed to run deeper than the situation alone could explain. "You do not even know me," I said. "Why would you drop everything to come get me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window before returning to me. "Priya told me your situation a few weeks ago. I told her to give you my number in case things got worse." I did not expect to actually receive that message tonight, but the moment I did, there was no version of events where I did not come. "That still does not explain why," I pressed, some stubborn part of me needing to understand the reasoning behind a rescue this immediate, this decisive. Something flickered across his face, gone before I could name it. "I have my reasons. We can talk about them another time, when you are not sitting here in someone else's coat with a bruise on your face." I let the subject drop, mostly because exhaustion was beginning to catch up with me now that the immediate danger had passed. The adrenaline that had carried me through the last hour was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep tiredness that made my eyes want to close despite everything. The car eventually slowed and turned through a set of iron gates that opened automatically as we approached. Beyond them, a large house came into view, warmly lit despite the late hour, surrounded by carefully kept grounds that spoke of quiet wealth, rather than the flashy kind I had grown accustomed to in Victor's family home. "We are here," Damien said, and I noticed he had shifted slightly, his posture straightening as though preparing himself for something. The car stopped in front of the entrance, and before I could reach for the door handle, it opened from the outside. A woman stood there, perhaps in her 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that immediately put me somewhat at ease. "This is Margareta," Damien said, stepping out of the car and offering his hand to help me down. "She runs this house, and she will look after you." Margareta studied me for a brief moment, her sharp eyes taking in the bruising, the torn sleeve beneath the coat, before her expression softened into something maternal. "Come inside, dear. Let us get you cleaned up and looked at properly." I followed her up a set of wide stone steps and into a foyer that seemed impossibly large after the cramped, controlling space I had just escaped. Damien walked a few paces behind us, and I was acutely aware of him the entire time, a steady presence at my back that felt protective rather than threatening, though I still could not fully explain why I trusted that instinct. The doctor was waiting in a bright room upstairs, a woman with quick, efficient hands and a gentle bedside manner, who examined my wrist and the bruise beneath my eye, without making me feel like an object of pity. She confirmed nothing was broken, though the wrist would need a wrap and some time to heal properly. As she worked, I found myself glancing toward the door, where I could see Damien standing just outside, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed somewhere down the hallway with an intensity that suggested his thoughts were far from calm, even if his face remained composed. "He has been standing there the whole time," the doctor said quietly, noticing where my attention had gone. "He does that. Waits, I mean, until he knows the people he brings here are safe." "Does he bring people here often?" I asked, curious despite myself. The doctor's expression grew thoughtful. "Not often, but when he does, it usually means something happened that made him very angry. You should know that Damien Cross does not do anything without a reason, and tonight, whatever reason drove him out that door, it burned hot enough that half his men were already in the car before he finished giving the order." I did not know what to make of that information, so I said nothing, letting her finish wrapping my wrist in silence. Once the examination was complete, Margareta led me to a bedroom on the second floor, spacious and quiet, decorated in soft colors that felt worlds away from the cold, controlling atmosphere of Victor's family home. A change of clothes had already been laid out on the bed, simple and comfortable, and a tray with tea and a small plate of food sat on the nightstand. "Eat something if you can," Margareta said gently, "and rest. Nobody is going to bother you here tonight, I promise you that." She left me alone, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to sit on the edge of the bed and simply breathe. My hands were still trembling slightly, though whether from lingering fear or the sheer release of tension, I could not say. I looked around the room, at the tall windows overlooking dark gardens below, at the warm lamplight and the soft blankets, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief settle over me. I had gone from a locked room in a house that felt like a cage to this, in the span of a single night, and I still did not fully understand why a man I had never met had decided my safety was worth this much effort. A soft knock came at the door sometime later, after I had changed into the clothes left for me and picked at the food without much appetite. I opened it to find Damien standing there, his earlier composure somewhat restored, though his eyes still carried a sharpness that had not been there before tonight, at least not that I had witnessed. "May I come in for a moment?" he asked. "Only if you are comfortable with that." I stepped back to let him enter, and he did, though he kept a respectful distance, choosing to stand near the window rather than approach me directly. I appreciated that more than I could say. "The doctor says you will heal fully," he said. "The wrist will take a couple of weeks, but there is no lasting damage." "Thank you," I said, and then, because the silence felt too heavy to bear otherwise, I added, "For all of this, I do not know how to repay something like this." His expression shifted, something almost pained crossing his features before he masked it again. "You do not owe me anything, Elena. Nobody should have to repay someone for basic decency." "This was not basic decency," I said. "You brought a small army to get me out of that house." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the window and the dark gardens beyond it. "When I saw what he had done to your face," he said finally, his voice low, "something in me went very quiet and very cold. I have not felt that particular kind of anger in a long time, and I did not like how easily it came back." "Why did it come back?" I asked softly. He turned to look at me then, and for a moment, I thought he might actually answer the question honestly. Instead, he seemed to catch himself, some old habit of restraint reasserting itself. "That is a longer conversation than you are ready for tonight. Rest, Elena. Tomorrow we can talk about what comes next, about keeping you safe from that family permanently. Tonight, you just need to sleep." He moved toward the door, and I found myself speaking before I could stop the words. "Will they come after me here?" He paused, his hand on the doorframe, and when he turned back to face me, there was a certainty in his expression that eased something tight in my chest. "Let them try," he said. "Nobody touches you again. Not while I am breathing." The conviction in his voice was not the kind of empty promise I had grown used to hearing from Victor, words meant to placate rather than protect. This felt different, weighted with something real, something that made me believe him despite every instinct telling me I should not trust a stranger this quickly. After he left, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the night over and over. The locked door, the message sent in desperation, the sound of tires on gravel, the stillness in Damien's face when he first saw the bruise on my cheek, a stillness that had nothing calm about it underneath the surface. I did not know yet what kind of world I had stepped into, or what it would mean to be under the protection of a man like Damien Cross. I only knew that for the first time in 8 months, I fell asleep without fear pressing down on my chest, and that alone felt like more than I had any right to expect. Somewhere in the house below, I later learned, Damien remained awake long into the night, speaking in low, controlled tones to the men who had accompanied him, making arrangements I would not fully understand until the following morning, arrangements that would set in motion a conflict I had not anticipated when I sent that single desperate message into the dark. I must have drifted off eventually, because I woke sometime before dawn to the quiet sound of rain against the window, and for a moment, I forgot where I was. My body tensed instinctively, my mind bracing for the familiar weight of fear that had greeted me every morning in Victor's house, the constant calculation of his mood before I even opened my eyes. It took several long seconds for the unfamiliar softness of the pillow beneath my head and the warm quiet of the room to register, and when it did, the tension in my shoulders eased slightly. I lay there listening to the rain, thinking about the strange turn my life had taken in the span of a single evening. Only hours ago, I had been certain that the locked door would give way to something far worse than an argument, and now I was lying in a house that felt, impossibly, like a kind of sanctuary. I thought about Damien's face when he first saw the bruise beneath my eye, the way his composure had cracked just slightly before he mastered it again. I thought about the certainty in his voice when he told me nobody would touch me again. I did not understand him yet. The stories I had heard about Damien Cross painted a man who dealt in fear and control, someone whose reputation kept an entire district quiet and obedient. But the man who had walked into that bedroom and looked at my injuries like a personal wound had shown me something entirely different, a kind of restrained fury that seemed to exist solely on my behalf, and I could not reconcile the two versions of him in my mind. Eventually I gave up trying to sleep and rose from the bed, wrapping myself in a soft robe that had been left in the closet, and made my way quietly toward the window. The gardens below were shrouded in the gray light before sunrise, rain falling steadily onto neatly trimmed hedges, and a stone path that wound toward what looked like a small greenhouse in the distance. It was peaceful, in a way that felt almost foreign to me after months of walking on eggshells, and I found myself pressing my palm against the cool glass, simply watching the rain fall. A soft sound from the hallway caught my attention, and I turned to find the door slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it the night before. I approached carefully, my heart picking up its pace again out of old habit, and found Margareta standing there, with a fresh tray of tea, her expression apologetic. "I did not mean to wake you, dear," she said. "I saw the light from your window, and thought you might want something warm." "You did not wake me," I admitted. "I could not sleep." She stepped inside and set the tray down on a small table near the window, studying me with the same sharp, kind eyes from the night before. "That is understandable, given everything. It takes time for the body to believe it is truly safe, even after the mind has been told so." I sat down across from her, wrapping my hands around the warm cup she offered, grateful for the simple comfort of it. "Has he done this before?" I asked. "Brought someone here like this?" Margareta considered the question for a moment before answering. "Once or twice, over the years, though never quite like this. Usually it involves business, people who owe him something, or people he needs kept safe for practical reasons. Last night was different. I have worked in this house a long time, and I have never seen him move that fast for anyone." Her words settled uneasily in my chest, stirring the same question I had asked Damien directly, and received only a partial answer to. Why had he come for me so quickly, with such force, when he barely knew me at all? "Do you know why?" I asked quietly. Margareta's expression grew thoughtful, almost careful, as though she were choosing her words with deliberate caution. "That is not my story to tell, dear, but I will say this much. Whatever his reasons, they run deeper than simple obligation. You should ask him yourself when he is ready to answer honestly." I did not press further, sensing that I would get nothing more from her on the subject, but the exchange left me with a quiet curiosity that lingered long after she left the room. I finished the tea slowly, watching the rain continue to fall outside, and tried to imagine what history could exist between myself and a man I had met for the first time only hours earlier. By the time the sun began to rise properly, casting pale light through the gray clouds, I had resolved to ask him directly, without accepting evasive answers this time. Whatever connected us, whatever had driven him to walk into that house without hesitation, I deserved to understand it, especially if I was going to remain under his protection while the situation with Victor's family unfolded. I dressed in the clothes left for me and made my way downstairs, following the quiet murmur of voices toward what I assumed was a kitchen or dining room. I found Damien there already, seated at a long table with papers spread before him, his expression focused and serious in a way that suggested he had not slept much, if at all. He looked up when I entered, and something in his face softened immediately, the sharp focus giving way to quiet concern. "You are awake early," he said. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little," I admitted, taking the seat he gestured toward. "Enough to feel more like myself." He studied me for a moment, and I could see him weighing whether to raise the subject that clearly still occupied his thoughts. "The people from last night will not be a problem again," he said finally. "I made that very clear before I left the house." "What did you tell them?" I asked. "That you are under my protection now, and that any attempt to reach you or harm you again would be met with consequences they would not enjoy." His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it that made the promise feel absolute rather than empty. I studied him across the table, taking in the exhaustion around his eyes, the careful control in his posture, and I found myself asking the question that had kept me awake half the night. "Margareta told me you have never moved this fast for anyone before. I want to know why." He set down the papers in his hands slowly, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, his gaze fixed somewhere past me, as though searching for the right way to begin. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual steadiness. "There is a reason, Elena," he said quietly, "but it is not a simple one, and I am not certain you are ready to hear it yet, not after everything you went through last night." "I think I deserve to know," I said, and I meant it, though my voice shook slightly with the effort of pushing past old habits of silence and deference. Something in his expression shifted, resolve settling over the earlier hesitation. "You are right," he said. "You do deserve to know. But let me tell you properly, when there is time to explain it fully, rather than rushing through it over breakfast while you are still recovering from last night. I promise you an honest answer, Elena, just not this exact moment." I studied him for a long moment, weighing whether to push further, and ultimately decided to let it rest, at least for now. Something in his eyes told me that whatever he was holding back mattered deeply to him, and that when he finally shared it, it would explain far more than just his reasons for rescuing me the night before. 3 days passed before Damien finally kept his promise. I had spent that time slowly settling into a rhythm within the house, though settling felt like too permanent a word for something that still seemed fragile and temporary. Margarethe checked on me each morning. The doctor returned once more to change the wrap on my wrist, and Damien remained a steady, careful presence throughout, always near but never crowding me, always watching, but never in a way that made my skin crawl the way Victor's attention once had. On the third evening, he found me in the small library on the ground floor, curled into a large chair with a book I had barely managed to read past the first chapter. My mind kept drifting back to that locked door, to the sound of splintering wood, and I had discovered that quiet moments alone were often the hardest to endure, filled as they were with the echo of everything I was trying to leave behind. "May I join you?" Damien asked from the doorway, and I nodded, setting the book aside. He crossed the room and took the chair across from mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the fire in the hearth crackling softly between us. I could tell he had come with intention tonight, that whatever conversation he had been putting off was finally ready to happen. "You asked me why I came for you so quickly," he said finally, his gaze fixed on the flames rather than on me. "I told you I would explain properly, and I meant that. But I need you to understand something first. What I am about to tell you involves people who hurt me a long time ago, and it is not an easy story for me to tell." "You do not have to," I said, though curiosity still burned quietly in my chest. "I want to," he said, and something in his voice told me he had made peace with that decision already. "When I was younger, before I built any of this, before I had the resources or the reputation I have now, there was a woman in my life. Her name was Isabel. She was my sister, though not by blood. Our families were close, close enough that we grew up together, and she was the only person in my early life who ever treated me with real kindness during a difficult time." I sat very still, sensing the weight behind his words, the careful way he chose each one, as though testing its sharpness before releasing it into the room. "Isabel married young, into a family that presented themselves well in public, and turned out to be something else entirely behind closed doors," he continued. "I did not see the signs at first. None of us did. She hid it well, the way people often do when they are ashamed or afraid. And by the time I understood what was happening to her, it was too late for me to help." His hands had curled into loose fists on his knees, and I watched him consciously relax them, forcing his voice to remain steady, even as the memory clearly cost him something. "She died," he said simply. "Not from a single violent moment, but from years of it, wearing her down slowly until her heart simply gave out one night, while her husband was out of the house. I found her myself. I was too late by hours, maybe longer." "Damien," I whispered, the weight of his grief settling over the room like a physical thing. "I tell you this not for sympathy," he said, meeting my eyes at last. "I tell you this because when Priya first told me about your situation weeks ago, about a young woman engaged to a man whose family had a certain reputation, I recognized something in the pattern immediately. And when your message came through that night, when I saw the bruise on your face with my own eyes, I was not only looking at you, Elena. For a moment, I was looking at Isabel, and I could not let history repeat itself while I had the power to stop it. I understood then, with sudden and painful clarity, why he had moved so fast, why the fury in his eyes that first night had burned so deeply personal. This was not simply an act of general protectiveness. It was a wound reopened, an old failure he refused to let happen a second time. "I am so sorry," I said quietly, "for what happened to her, and I am sorry that my situation brought all of that back for you." "Do not apologize," he said firmly. "You did nothing wrong, not that night and not any night before it. If anything, I am grateful that this time, I was able to act before it became too late. You gave me a chance to do something I could not do for her." We sat in silence for a while after that, the fire slowly burning down, and I found myself studying him with new understanding. The careful control, the quiet steadiness beneath the reputation of danger that surrounded his name, it all made more sense now, layered over a grief that had clearly shaped the man he had become. "Can I ask you something else?" I said eventually. "Of course. What happened to her husband, after she died?" Something dark flickered across his expression, gone as quickly as it appeared. He is no longer a concern for anyone, he said, and the finality in his tone told me not to press further on that particular thread. I nodded, understanding enough not to ask for details, and we settled into a more comfortable silence, one that felt less like the heavy weight of confession and more like the quiet companionship of two people who had shared something meaningful. "There is something else you should know," Damien said after a while, his tone shifting back toward practical matters. "Victor's family is not the kind to simply let this go. His father, Nathaniel, has built a name for himself through connections that overlap with mine in certain uncomfortable ways. He will likely try to reach out, either to negotiate your return or to threaten consequences if you do not comply." The mention of Nathaniel's name sent a small chill through me, memories of the cold, calculating man surfacing unwillingly. He had always been more dangerous than Victor in his own quiet way, the architect behind the arrangement that had trapped me in that house in the first place. "What will you do?" I asked. "Whatever is necessary to keep you safe," Damien said simply. "I have already made it clear to certain people that any attempt to reach you will not be tolerated. But Nathaniel is not a man who responds well to boundaries, and I suspect this will not resolve itself quietly." As if summoned by the conversation itself, a soft knock came at the library door, and one of Damien's men, the same broad-shouldered figure from that first night, stepped inside with a grim expression. "Sir," he said, "Nathaniel Hale is here. He is asking to speak with you directly." Damien's posture shifted instantly, the earlier softness giving way to something harder, more controlled. He rose from his chair, and I found myself rising with him, my pulse quickening at the mention of that name arriving at the door so soon after we had discussed the possibility. "Stay here," Damien said gently, though there was no room for argument in his tone. "I will handle this." "I want to hear what he says," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my own voice. "I have spent months being talked about instead of talked to. I am done with that." Damien studied me for a moment, something like respect flickering across his features, before he nodded once. "Stay close to me then, and let me do the talking unless I ask otherwise." We walked together toward the front entrance, where I could already hear voices, low and tense, drifting from the foyer. Nathaniel Hale stood just inside the doorway, flanked by two men I did not recognize, his expensive coat still damp from the evening rain, his expression carrying the same cold calculation I remembered from countless family dinners. His eyes found me immediately, narrowing slightly at the sight of me standing beside Damien, no longer trembling, no longer hiding. "Elena," he said, his voice smooth in the way that had always unsettled me more than outright anger ever could. "You look well. I am glad to see whatever misunderstanding occurred did not leave lasting damage." "There was no misunderstanding," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Your son hurt me, repeatedly. I am not coming back." Nathaniel's expression did not change, though something behind his eyes hardened. "This is a family matter, Mr. Cross. I would ask that you not involve yourself further in affairs that do not concern you." "She is not obligated to return to a house where she is not safe," Damien said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "That makes it very much my concern, given that she is currently under my protection." "Your protection," Nathaniel repeated, something almost amused in his tone, though it did not reach his eyes. "An interesting choice of words for a man in your line of work. I wonder what your protection is truly worth, when it comes down to it." "Test it, and find out," Damien said simply. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the tension in the room thick enough to feel against my skin. I watched Nathaniel's men shift slightly, watched Damien's own people position themselves subtly around the foyer, and I understood, with sudden clarity, that this conversation was balancing on a very thin edge. "My son made mistakes," Nathaniel said eventually, his tone shifting toward something more conciliatory, though I did not trust the change for a moment. "He is willing to make amends, to ensure something like this does not happen again. Surely we can resolve this like reasonable people, without involving matters that could escalate beyond anyone's control." "There is nothing to resolve," I said before Damien could respond. "I am not returning, and I am not interested in amends. What happened in that house was not a mistake. It was a pattern, and I refuse to be part of it any longer." Nathaniel's gaze settled on me again, colder this time, the earlier smoothness giving way to something more honest. You will find, Elena, that walking away from an arrangement like ours carries consequences. Reputations matter in circles like the ones your family once hoped to join. People will ask questions about why you left, and the answers will not reflect well on you, regardless of the truth. Threaten her again, Damien said quietly, stepping slightly forward, and this conversation will end very differently than you seem to expect. The room went utterly silent for a moment, and I watched something calculate behind Nathaniel's eyes, some assessment of risk and reward that clearly did not favor pushing further tonight. He straightened his coat, his expression smoothing back into cold civility. "This is not finished," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I will be in touch, Mr. Cross, through more appropriate channels." "You will not be welcome here again," Damien said. "Any further contact should go through legal representation, nothing else." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, turning instead toward the door with his men following behind him. I watched through the tall windows as their car pulled away down the long driveway, disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness beyond the gates, and only then did I feel the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. "He will not simply let this go," I said quietly, once the sound of the car had faded completely. "No," Damien agreed. "He will not. Men like Nathaniel do not respond well to losing control over something they consider theirs. But you are not his to control anymore, Elena, and I intend to make certain that remains true." I looked up at him, at the quiet determination in his expression, and thought again of Isabel, of the grief he carried for a woman he had been unable to save. I understood now that his protection of me was not simply duty or obligation. It was something far more personal, a chance at redemption he was determined not to let slip away. "Thank you," I said softly, "for tonight, for everything." "Do not thank me yet," he said, his tone gentling as he looked down at me. "This is only the beginning of what is likely to come. But I promise you, Elena, whatever Nathaniel decides to do, you will not face it alone." Standing there in the quiet foyer, with the rain still falling steadily outside, and the echo of Nathaniel's threats hanging in the air, I found myself believing him completely, in a way I had not allowed myself to believe anyone in a very long time. We returned to the library once the house had settled back into quiet, and Damien poured 2 glasses of something warm and amber-colored, handing one to me, before settling back into his chair by the dying fire. I wrapped my hands around the glass without drinking, simply grateful for the warmth of it against my still trembling fingers. "You handled that better than most people would," he said, studying me over the rim of his own glass. "Nathaniel has a way of making people doubt themselves. I have watched grown men lose their nerve in front of him. I spent 8 months learning exactly how dangerous quiet, calm anger can be," I said. "His voice never changes, no matter what he is threatening. That used to be the most frightening part." Damien nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression. Fear that announces itself is easier to prepare for. It is the quiet kind that lingers longest. We sat with that thought for a while, the fire crackling low, and I found myself studying his face in the dim light, searching for traces of the grief he had shared with me earlier, buried now beneath careful composure. "Can I ask you something else?" I said, "about Isabel?" His expression shifted slightly, though he nodded for me to continue. "Do you think she would recognize the man you have become, because of what happened to her?" He considered the question with more seriousness than I expected, his gaze drifting toward the fire. "I have wondered that many times," he admitted. "I think part of her would be proud, knowing I built something strong enough to protect people the way I could not protect her. But I also think part of her would grieve what it cost me to become this. Power like mine does not come without a price, Elena. I have made choices over the years that I am not proud of, decisions that hardened me in ways I sometimes regret." "You do not seem hardened to me," I said quietly. "Not toward me, at least." Something softened in his expression at that, a flicker of warmth breaking through the careful control he usually maintained. "That is because you remind me why any of this matters in the first place. It is easy to lose sight of that, running an operation as large as mine. Most of what I deal with involves numbers, territory, negotiations that have nothing to do with the reasons I started down this path originally. You brought that reason back into focus rather sharply. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply held his gaze for a long moment, feeling something shift quietly between us, something I was not yet ready to name but could not deny either. "What happens now?" I asked eventually, steering the conversation towards safer, more practical ground. With Nathaniel, I mean. He did not sound like a man who intends to simply walk away. "He will try legal pressure first," Damien said, his tone turning businesslike again. "Questions about the engagement, perhaps threats of lawsuits over broken arrangements, though he has no real grounds for anything of the sort. When that fails, and it will fail, he may attempt something less official. I have people watching for exactly that possibility." "And if he does something less official," I asked, "what happens then?" Damien's expression grew serious, the warmth from moments earlier giving way to something colder and more resolved. "Then he will learn precisely why people in this city do not test me twice. I do not say that to frighten you, Elena. I say it because I need you to trust that I am prepared for whatever comes, in every direction it might come from." I believed him. There was no performance in his words, no empty bravado meant to impress or reassure falsely. It was simply fact, stated plainly, and something in me settled at hearing it, a fragile trust beginning to take root where only fear had lived for so long. "I should let you rest," Damien said eventually, rising from his chair as the fire burned down to embers. "Tomorrow will likely bring more complications, and you have already endured enough for one evening." I rose as well, setting my untouched glass aside, and for a moment we stood close together in the dim firelight, neither of us quite ready to end the conversation despite the late hour. "Thank you," I said again, "for trusting me with the truth about Isabel. I know that could not have been easy to share. Some truths are worth the discomfort," he said quietly, "especially when they help someone else understand why they matter enough to fight for." He walked me to the base of the stairs, and we parted there, his eyes lingering on me a moment longer than strictly necessary, before he turned back toward the study, presumably to continue the arrangements he had mentioned making days before. I climbed the stairs slowly, my mind turning over everything the evening had revealed, the grief and the resolve tangled together in a man who had walked into my life as a stranger and was quickly becoming something far more complicated than a rescuer. Sleep did not come easily that night, my thoughts circling between Nathaniel's cold threats and the quiet vulnerability Damien had shown me by the fire. But beneath the uncertainty, something steadier had taken hold as well, a growing conviction that whatever came next, I would not be facing it from the locked room I had escaped only days before. A week passed in a strange, fragile calm. I began to find small routines within the walls of Damien's house, mornings spent reading in the library, afternoons walking the gardens with Margarete when the weather allowed, evenings often spent in quiet conversation with Damien himself, our talks growing longer and less guarded each time. But calm, I had learned, rarely lasted long where Nathaniel Hale was concerned. It was a gray Tuesday afternoon when the first sign of trouble arrived, not through the front gates this time, but through a phone call that pulled Damien away from lunch, with an urgency that immediately set my nerves on edge. I watched his expression darken as he listened, his jaw tightening with each passing second, until he finally lowered the phone and turned to face me. "Victor was seen near the market district this morning," he said, "asking questions about your movements, about whether you had been seen leaving this property." My appetite vanished instantly, old fear crawling back up my spine despite the safety I had begun to trust in over the past week. "Do you think he is planning something?" "I think Nathaniel is testing boundaries through his son, since his own attempts at pressure have gone nowhere," Damien said, his voice measured despite the visible tension in his shoulders. "It is a common tactic. Use someone less directly connected to probe for weaknesses without risking exposure themselves." "What do we do?" I asked, hating the slight tremor that crept into my voice, despite my best efforts to sound steady. "We do nothing rash," Damien said firmly. "You stay close to the house, and I increase security around the property. Victor is not stupid enough to attempt anything drastic on his own, not with his father's reputation at stake, but I will not underestimate him either." The following days brought a shift in the atmosphere of the house, a quiet vigilance replacing the earlier calm. Damien's men moved through the property with greater frequency, and I noticed new faces stationed at the gates, their presence a constant reminder that the danger I had escaped had not truly disappeared, only retreated temporarily. I tried to occupy myself with small tasks, helping Margareta in the kitchen, reading through books Damien recommended from his study, but my mind kept circling back to the uncertainty hanging over everything. One evening, unable to settle, I found Damien in his study, reviewing reports with a focus that suggested he had not left the room in hours. "You should rest," I said from the doorway, echoing words he had once said to me. He looked up, a tired but genuine smile crossing his face at the sight of me. "I could say the same to you. You have been pacing this house for 2 days." "I do not like feeling helpless," I admitted, stepping into the room and settling into the chair across from his desk. "In that house, with Victor, I learned to shrink myself down, to become as small and unnoticeable as possible, to avoid setting him off. I do not want to live that way again, even here, even safe." Damien set down the papers in his hands, giving me his full attention. "You are not helpless, Elena. You survived 8 months in a situation designed to break you down, and you still had the strength to reach out for help the moment an opportunity presented itself. That is not weakness. That is remarkable resilience." His words settled something in my chest, a warmth I had not expected to feel this deeply from simple validation. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for seeing it that way." "It is simply the truth," he said, "though I understand the desire to do something more active than waiting. If it would help, I could use your insight. You know Victor and Nathaniel better than anyone here, their habits, their weaknesses, the way they think. That knowledge could prove valuable." I appreciated the offer more than I could easily express, the simple act of being consulted, rather than protected into passivity, feeling like its own small victory. Over the following hour, I found myself sharing details I had never spoken aloud before, patterns of behavior I had observed during my time in that house, weaknesses in the family's carefully maintained public image that Damien listened to with focused attention, occasionally jotting notes as I spoke. "This is helpful," he said, once I had exhausted what I knew. "More helpful than you realize. Nathaniel has built his reputation on appearing untouchable, a man of impeccable public standing. If certain truths about how that family actually operates behind closed doors were to surface, through proper channels, it could weaken his position considerably, without requiring anything drastic on my part." "You mean expose him?" I said, understanding dawning. "Quietly, and through people who owe me favors in journalism and certain regulatory circles," Damien confirmed. "Men like Nathaniel fear public scrutiny far more than they fear direct confrontation. It strips away the very thing that gives them power in circles where reputation determines influence." The plan took shape over the following days, careful and methodical, nothing like the reckless confrontation I had half expected given the tension of recent events. Damien's approach, I was beginning to understand, relied less on brute intimidation and more on patient, calculated pressure applied in precisely the right places. It was nearly a week later when the situation finally came to a head, not through careful planning this time, but through Victor's own recklessness. I was walking the garden path near the eastern wall of the property, enjoying a rare moment of solitude in the late afternoon sun, when a familiar voice called out from beyond the hedge line, closer than any voice had a right to be given the security surrounding the estate. "Elena." I froze, recognizing Victor's voice immediately, and turned to find him standing just beyond a gap in the hedges, close enough to the property line that alarm shot through me instantly. He looked worse than I remembered, his usual polished appearance replaced by something more disheveled, his eyes carrying a wild, desperate edge that frightened me more than his usual calculated anger ever had. "You should not be here," I said, backing away instinctively even as I called out for the nearest guard. "I need to talk to you," he said, moving closer, despite my clear retreat. "Just talk. That is all I want." "There is nothing left to say," I replied, my voice shaking, despite my best efforts to steady it. "You need to leave before this gets worse for you." "Worse?" he laughed, though there was no humor in the sound, only a brittle, unstable edge. "My father is furious with me for how badly I have handled this. My reputation is falling apart." Do you have any idea what you have cost me by running to that man? Before I could respond, footsteps pounded across the grass behind me, and I turned to find two of Damien's men, closing the distance rapidly, their expressions hard with focused purpose. Victor's eyes widened at the sight of them, his earlier bravado faltering as he realized how quickly he had been noticed. "This is private property," one of the guards said firmly, positioning himself between Victor and myself. "You need to leave immediately." "I only wanted to talk to her," Victor said, though he was already retreating slightly, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the situation he had clearly not fully thought through. "You do not get that privilege anymore," the second guard said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I watched Victor's face cycle through anger, desperation, and finally something close to defeat, as he realized the encounter was not going to unfold the way he had hoped. He took a final step backward, his eyes finding mine one last time. "This is not over," he said, though the words carried far less weight than they once might have. "My father will make sure of that." He turned and disappeared back through the gap in the hedges, and moments later, I heard the sound of a car engine starting somewhere beyond the property line, fading quickly into the distance. My legs finally gave out slightly beneath me, adrenaline draining away and leaving a shaky weakness in its wake, and one of the guards steadied me gently by the elbow. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his earlier hardness giving way to genuine concern. "I think so," I managed. "Please, someone needs to tell Damien." Word had already reached him by the time they escorted me back toward the house, and I found him waiting on the front steps, his expression a careful mask over what I could tell was considerable alarm. The moment he saw me, he crossed the distance between us quickly, his hands settling gently on my shoulders as his eyes searched my face for any sign of harm. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with barely restrained emotion. "No," I said. He did not touch me. The guards got there before he could get close enough. Relief flickered across his features, quickly replaced by a hardening resolve that reminded me sharply of that first night, the quiet fury beneath his controlled exterior. "This ends now," he said. "I have given Nathaniel every opportunity to handle this reasonably. That patience has run out." "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Something I should have done from the very beginning," he said, his voice carrying a certainty that sent a chill through me, though not one born of fear for myself this time. "Come inside. There is a great deal we need to discuss, and very little time to waste, before Nathaniel realizes his son's recklessness has forced my hand." As we walked back into the house together, I felt the fragile calm of the past week give way entirely to something sharper, more urgent, and I understood with sudden clarity that whatever came next would determine, once and for all, whether I would ever be truly free of the family that had once controlled every aspect of my existence. Inside, Damien led me straight to the study, where Margareta brought tea neither of us touched, and a man I recognized only vaguely from the first night, Marcus, arrived within minutes, a folder tucked under his arm, and a grim expression on his face. "Show her what we found," Damien said, gesturing for me to sit. Marcus spread several documents across the desk, financial records and correspondence that meant little to me at first glance, though Damien's finger traced through them with the confidence of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. "We have been building this for the past several days," he explained. "Records of Nathaniel's business dealings, several of which do not hold up well under scrutiny. Falsified permits, payments routed through accounts that should not exist, connections to people his public reputation would never survive being associated with. You were planning this before Victor showed up today," I said, understanding settling over me. "I told you I intended to weaken his position without unnecessary violence," Damien said. "This was already in motion. Victor's recklessness this afternoon simply means we no longer have the luxury of moving slowly." "What happens once this becomes public?" I asked, studying the documents with new interest. "Nathaniel loses everything that matters to him," Marcus said, speaking for the first time since entering the room. "His standing among people who currently respect him, his ability to conduct business through legitimate channels, the reputation he has spent decades building. Men like him survive on the appearance of respectability. Strip that away, and the foundation crumbles quickly." "And Victor?" I asked quietly. "What happens to him?" Damien's expression grew more careful at the question. watching me closely as he answered. That depends largely on what you want, Elena. I can ensure he faces consequences proportional to what he did to you specifically, separate from whatever happens to his father's broader empire. But I want your input on that, not simply my own judgment. The question caught me off guard, the sudden weight of choice settling on my shoulders after months of having none. I sat with it for a long moment, turning over the anger and fear that Victor's name still stirred in me, weighing it against something that felt, surprisingly, like a desire to simply be free of him entirely, rather than locked into any continued conflict. I do not want revenge, I said slowly, working through the thought as I spoke it aloud. I do not want to become someone who needs him punished to feel whole again. I just want him gone from my life completely, unable to reach me or threaten me ever again. Damien studied me for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his features. That is a stronger position than most people could hold, given what he did to you. I spent 8 months being small and afraid, I said. I do not want the rest of my life defined by him either, even through punishment. I would rather it be defined by something else entirely. Then we will make certain he is legally and permanently barred from any contact with you, Damien said, turning back to Marcus. Restraining orders through proper legal channels, with enough documented evidence behind them that violating those orders would carry serious consequences on their own, separate from anything involving his father's collapsing business empire. Marcus nodded, already making notes on a separate sheet of paper, and the practical details of the plan continued to take shape around me, methodical and precise, in a way that felt worlds apart from the chaotic fear that had defined my life only weeks earlier. I found myself watching Damien throughout the discussion, noting the careful way he kept returning to my preferences, my comfort, never simply assuming what I wanted without asking directly. This will take time to execute properly, Damien said once Marcus had gathered the documents and left the room. A few weeks, perhaps, to ensure everything is airtight before it becomes public. Can you manage that long, knowing Victor may attempt something else in the meantime? With the security here, I think so, I said, and found that I actually believed it. A steadiness in my own voice that would have seemed impossible only a month before. Good, Damien said, though something softer crept into his expression as he studied me across the desk. You handled that decision well, about Victor, better than many people would have, given everything he put you through. I had good guidance, I said, offering a small, genuine smile, despite the exhaustion of the day. Someone who kept reminding me the choice was mine to make. Something warm flickered in his eyes at that, though he said nothing further on the subject, instead rising to gather the remaining papers scattered across the desk. As the evening wore on and the details of the plan solidified further, I felt something settle within me that had been missing for longer than I cared to admit. A sense of agency returning slowly to a life that had been controlled by fear and other people's decisions for far too long. 3 weeks passed before everything finally came apart for the Hale family, and I watched it unfold with a strange mixture of vindication and quiet exhaustion. The culmination of a plan that had consumed nearly every conversation in Damien's house since that frightening afternoon in the garden. The first article appeared on a Monday morning, a careful, meticulously sourced piece detailing financial irregularities in Nathaniel's business dealings, published through a journalist Damien had worked with before. Someone whose reputation for accuracy meant the story could not simply be dismissed as rumor or personal vendetta. By Wednesday, 2 more outlets had picked up the thread, digging further into records that Marcus and his team had spent weeks compiling. I read each article at the kitchen table, Margaretha hovering nearby with fresh coffee, and felt something loosen in my chest with each new revelation that chipped away at the carefully constructed image Nathaniel had spent decades building. The falsified permits, the questionable business partners, the pattern of behavior that painted a picture entirely different from the respectable, untouchable man he had always presented to the world. How does it feel? Damien asked me one evening, finding me still scrolling through coverage on my phone, long after dinner had ended. Strange, I admitted. I thought I would feel triumphant. Mostly, I just feel tired. That is a normal response, he said, settling into the chair beside me, rather than across from me this time, a small shift that had become common between us over the past weeks. Relief often looks quieter than people expect. The adrenaline of fear sustains itself for a long time. When it finally has permission to fade, exhaustion tends to fill the space it leaves behind. I set the phone aside, studying him in the warm evening light. You understand that better than most people would. I have had a great deal of practice with exactly that particular exhaustion, he said, something wry in his tone, though not unkind. The restraining order against Victor had been finalized the previous week, backed by enough documented evidence, including testimony I had given carefully and deliberately, that even his family's remaining influence could not prevent it from holding legal weight. I had not seen him since that afternoon in the garden, and something in me suspected I never would again, not directly. The reports suggested he had left the city entirely, seeking somewhere his family name carried less weight and fewer consequences trailed behind him. Nathaniel himself remained defiant publicly for a while, issuing statements denying wrongdoing, threatening legal action against the journalists involved, but the evidence proved too thorough, too carefully documented, to be dismissed indefinitely. By the end of the third week, his business partners had begun quietly distancing themselves, contracts dissolving, invitations to certain circles no longer arriving. The empire he had spent his life constructing was crumbling, not through violence or direct confrontation, but through the patient exposure of truths he had spent decades hiding. You did this without a single act of violence, I said one evening, marveling at the precision of it all as we sat together in the library, a fire crackling low in the hearth much as it had that first night he told me about Isabel. Violence would have made you complicit in something ugly, Damien said, and it would have given him grounds to paint himself as a victim rather than what he actually is. This way, the truth did the work. Nobody can argue that documented facts are an act of aggression. I considered that, turning it over in my mind. You could have simply destroyed him the way people expect someone like you to operate. Why did you choose this instead? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire, before he answered. Because Isabel deserved better than a world where the only response to cruelty is more cruelty. I built a great deal of my life around power, Elena, and power used carelessly becomes just another version of what hurt her in the first place. I try to remember that, even when patience feels harder than the alternative. Something in his answer settled deep in my chest, warm and steady, and I found myself reaching across the small distance between our chairs to take his hand, an instinct I did not fully examine before acting on it. He looked down at our joined hands with visible surprise, then up at my face, searching for permission I offered freely with a small nod. Thank you, I said quietly, for choosing this way, for choosing me, honestly, from that very first night. I would choose it again, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Every single time. We sat like that for a long while, the fire slowly burning down, neither of us in any hurry to break the quiet comfort that had settled between us. It was Damien who finally spoke again, his tone carrying a hesitance I had not heard from him before, not even during our most vulnerable conversations. I need to ask you something, he said, and I want you to feel completely free to answer honestly, without any concern for how it might affect your place here. All right, I said, curiosity, and something warmer stirring beneath the surface of my calm. These past weeks, he began carefully, have meant more to me than I expected they would when I first opened that door and saw you standing there. I did not anticipate that helping you would come to mean something so personal, so far beyond the original reasons that drove me to act. I find myself wanting to know you, not simply as someone I protect, but as someone I might build something real with, if you wanted that too. My heart pounded against my ribs, though for entirely different reasons than the fear that had once accompanied that particular rhythm. Damien, I said softly, I have spent the past month learning what it feels like to be safe again, to make my own choices without fear shaping every decision. I do not want to rush into anything simply because gratitude makes it feel urgent. I would never want that, he said quickly. I am not asking for urgency, Elena. I am simply telling you honestly what I feel, so that you have the truth to consider, whenever and however you choose to consider it. I studied his face in the firelight, the careful vulnerability there, so different from the controlled composure he presented to the rest of the world, and felt something settle within me with quiet certainty. I think, I said slowly, that what I feel for you is not simply gratitude. It has not been, for some time now. I have just been afraid to name it, afraid of moving too quickly after everything that happened. Then we will move as slowly as you need, he said, his voice gentle but steady with conviction. There is no timeline here, Elena, only the choice to see where this leads, whenever you feel ready to take that step. I found myself smiling, a genuine warmth spreading through me that felt entirely unfamiliar after months of careful, guarded emotion. I think I am more ready than I realized, I said, sitting here with you, feeling safe enough to actually consider what I want, instead of simply surviving what I do not. The following weeks brought a gentle unfolding between us, careful and unhurried, built on the foundation of trust that had grown steadily since that first frightening night. Nathaniel's empire continued its slow collapse in the background, a quiet vindication that no longer consumed my thoughts the way it once had, replaced instead by the simple, growing comfort of a life I was finally building on my own terms. I moved through the house differently now, no longer a guest sheltering from danger, but something closer to a permanent resident, my presence woven naturally into the daily rhythm of the estate. Margaretha began teaching me small things about running such a large household, patient and encouraging, in a way that reminded me, gently, that I was capable of far more than the past 8 months had led me to believe. Marcus and the other men who worked for Damien grew familiar and even friendly, no longer strangers whose job was simply to protect me, but people who had become, in their own quiet way, something like a found family around me. There was one evening, near the end of that second month, that stood apart from the quiet domestic rhythm we had settled into. Damien had been invited to a charity gala hosted by a business association that, until recently, had counted Nathaniel among its most prominent members. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier, before the scandal broke fully, and Damien had asked, carefully and without any pressure, whether I would consider attending with him. "You do not have to," he said. "I understand, if the idea of stepping into that world again feels like too much." I had thought about it for days, turning the decision over in my mind, weighing the old instinct to stay small and hidden against a newer, steadier voice that had grown louder since I arrived at this house. In the end, I chose to go, not because I felt obligated, but because some part of me wanted to prove to myself that I could walk into a room full of people who had once known me as Victor's quiet, overlooked fiancé, and stand there instead as someone entirely different. The evening of the gala, Margaretha helped me dress, her hands steady and encouraging as she fastened the final clasp of a deep blue gown that felt nothing like the careful, muted clothing Nathaniel's family had once insisted I wear. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back, not because anything about my face had changed, but because the posture, the steadiness in her eyes, belonged to someone who no longer flinched from being seen. Damien met me at the base of the stairs, and the way his expression shifted at the sight of me, open admiration mixed with something gentler and more protective, settled any lingering nerves I carried about the evening ahead. "You look remarkable," he said simply, offering his arm. The gala itself unfolded exactly as I had both hoped and feared. Whispers followed us through the crowded ballroom, curious glances from people who clearly recognized me from the scandal still unfolding in the papers, though the whispers carried a different tone than the ones I remembered from my time with Victor's family. Curiosity now, rather than the careful, dismissive pity that had once trailed behind me at similar events. A woman I vaguely recognized from Nathaniel's old social circle approached us near the refreshment table, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone testing the waters before committing to a particular opinion. "Elena," she said. "It has been some time. I hope you are well, given everything in the papers lately." "I am better than I have been in a long while," I said, meeting her gaze steadily, without the old instinct to shrink or apologize for simply existing in the room. "Thank you for asking." Something in my steadiness seemed to satisfy whatever test she had been running, and she offered a small, genuine smile before moving on, and I felt Damien's hand tighten slightly around mine in quiet approval. We moved through the rest of the evening together, and though I caught more curious glances throughout the night, none of them carried the power to unsettle me the way similar attention once might have. By the time we left, several hours later, I felt something like triumph settle over the earlier nerves, a quiet victory that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with simply reclaiming a version of myself I had feared lost forever. "You handled that beautifully," Damien said as we rode home together, the city lights blurring past the car windows. "I was terrified walking in," I admitted, but somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped worrying about what they were saying about me and just focused on being exactly who I actually am now. "That is the entire difference," Damien said, reaching over to take my hand. "Not who you present, but who you actually are, standing firmly in it, regardless of the audience." The memory of that evening stayed with me in the weeks that followed, a quiet marker of how far I had traveled since that first desperate night, and it was against the backdrop of that steady, hard-won confidence that the quiet garden evening finally arrived. On a clear evening nearly 2 months after that first desperate message sent from a locked bedroom, Damien found me in the garden where Victor had once confronted me, though the memory of that afternoon had softened considerably, overshadowed now by countless better moments spent in the same peaceful space. He carried 2 cups of tea, settling beside me on the stone bench without a word, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. "I have been thinking," he said eventually, "about that first night. About how frightened you looked, standing in that doorway, and how certain I was that I would do whatever it took to make sure you never felt that way again." "You succeeded," I said softly, leaning slightly into his side, a gesture that had become natural between us over recent weeks. "I do not think I have felt truly frightened since that night, not the way I used to." "Good," he said, his arms settling around my shoulders with familiar warmth. "That is exactly what I hoped for, from the very beginning." I looked up at him, studying the quiet contentment in his expression, so different from the controlled intensity I remembered from our first meeting. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," I asked, "if I had never sent that message? If Priya had never given me your number in the first place?" "I try not to," he admitted, his expression growing briefly serious. "I think about Isabel instead, and I am simply grateful that this time, the ending was different, that I was not too late." "You were not too late," I confirmed softly, reaching up to touch his face gently, an intimacy that would have felt impossible only months before, when trust itself seemed like a luxury I could no longer afford. "You arrived exactly when I needed you to, and every day since has been proof that I made the right choice, reaching out that night." He turned his head slightly, pressing a soft kiss against my palm, and something in the gesture felt like the culmination of everything we had built together since that terrifying first night, gentle and certain in a way that required no further words to explain its meaning. "Elena," he said quietly, "I know we agreed to take this slowly, and I meant that promise completely. But I want you to know, whenever you are ready, whatever pace feels right to you, that my feelings for you are not going anywhere. This is not gratitude misread as something deeper, and it is not simply the echo of an old grief finding new purpose. This is you, specifically, exactly as you are, someone I choose again every single day I wake up in this house." Tears gathered unexpectedly in my eyes, though they carried none of the fear or pain that had accompanied so many tears before them, only a quiet, overwhelming gratitude for the strange, frightening night that had led me here, to this garden, to this man, to a version of safety I had once believed impossible to find again. "I choose you too," I said softly, the words carrying a certainty that surprised even me with its steadiness, not out of fear, and not out of gratitude alone, but because somewhere in these past 2 months, you became the person I want beside me, not because I need protecting, but because I want to be here, with you, exactly as I am now. The sunset continued its slow descent beyond the garden walls, painting the sky in deepening shades of color, and I sat there beside Damien, feeling for the first time in longer than I could remember, not like someone who had survived something terrible, but like someone building something genuinely good, deliberately, and entirely on her own terms. The locked door, the splintering wood, the desperate message sent into the dark, all of it had led me here, to this quiet garden, and this steady, careful man who had looked at my bruises that first night and seen not weakness, but someone worth saving completely. I no longer needed saving now, not the way I once had. But I understood, sitting there in the fading light, that some people simply choose to stay anyway, not out of necessity, but out of the quiet, powerful certainty of having finally found somewhere they truly belonged.